Hey, my name is Reverend Nicole, Reverend Nikki, Reverend Guns. I go by all of those names. I am the college and young adult pastor here at Second Calvary Baptist Church. And I do a lot of things in life. By profession, I'm a nurse. I'm assistant director of nursing at a nursing facility. And I am also the assistant general secretary of the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, the first woman to be in the presidential cabinet in 144 years. So really, really, really excited about what God is doing. So today we are going to be talking about the roles that women have played in the Bible. Some women who are not as well known as other women, and just the impact and the significance of their roles and their lives. Oftentimes, women in the Bible don't have the dominant role in Scripture. And so we often minimize their presence and their impact because they may not be named. For example, we may know the name of the husband and not the name of the wife. There are these instances in Scripture where the character was a woman, but over the years through translation, their names were changed to masculine names to decrease the impact of women in the early church. And so I think it's important that we highlight women in Scripture because their role is just as significant to the greater story of God. You know, it's really this patriarchal mindset to think that women did not play a significant role in Scripture. So there were women in the Scripture, in the New Testament, who helped to fund the ministry of Paul. So you think about that. Women who were entrepreneurs, women who owned businesses and who had these big, huge, significant homes. This is important because in the early church, they didn't have Second Calvary Baptist Church. They didn't have New Birth and all these other churches. They met in the homes of people. And so we know the house of Lydia was where a church met. We know that the house of Mary was where a church met, which shows how significant these women were as church leaders. There is the presence of the daughters of Zelophehad in the book of Numbers. These daughters, these women, they challenged the inheritance laws in Israel when their father died. So their father died and there were no sons to inherit his land. And so these women, these daughters, boldly approached Moses and challenged the system and declared that they deserved the right to their father's property just like any other person. And so their petition results in the changing of the law, and it showed their strength in advocating for justice and equality. So there's also Esther. You know, Esther was significant in the salvation of the Jewish people. Yet again, Esther was someone who stood before the king. She could have faced death, but she challenged the system, and as a result, the whole community was saved. There are these biblical writers who had a patriarchal approach to Scripture. And so that's why sometimes you will hear about Lot, but then Lot's wife doesn't have a name. Clearly, the writer could figure out what Lot's name was, and the wife was right there, but we don't know her name. You know, we hear about people's daughters and their wives and their this and their that, and they don't have names. You know, and that became so real to me when I went to seminary, and we really discussed about how many times the names of women was not included in Scripture. And so for me, that really highlighted the significance of saying her name. And even as African Americans and women in the course of history, our names have not always been said. And so I think it's important to say the names of women. I think it's important that when Scripture does highlight names of women, that shows just how significant these women were in the text. Here's an example. So in the book of Romans, Paul talks about someone named Junius, Junias. Earlier translations identify this individual as Junia, Junia. So over the course of time, her name was changed to a masculine name, dependent on the translation that you look at. So this woman, Junia, was important to the ministry of Paul, and Paul even identifies her as an apostle. He identifies this individual, Junia, as an outstanding apostle in the book of Romans. And so if we say that this woman played a significant role in the ministry of the early church to be identified as an apostle, then that now changes how we have to look at a lot of things. So that becomes problematic for some people. So that's why studying scripture, you really have to know and understand what you're studying. And it's also important to study with someone who has studied. Because if I'm just teaching what I think and feel and believe in my heart, I may not be teaching everything accurately. I may not be teaching. And that's how you get this false doctrine. That's how you go from women playing a significant role in the life of the church to now in some churches, women not being permitted to speak. Because that is the case in some churches, and even when Paul talked about women not speaking, he was talking about a specific church. He was not talking to the church at large. He was talking to specific congregations because of the issues they had in that congregation. But here's the thing. Do we give more credence to Paul or to Jesus? Did Jesus ever say that women should be silent? Did Jesus ever say that women couldn't lead? Did Jesus ever say any of that? No, Jesus didn't. So now, do we hold Paul higher than Jesus? God is not for the oppression of people based on how they look or how their gender, their race. That God is not for that oppression. And we like to often portray God as being on the side of certain people, that if you are a certain way, then God is just on your side. But I would argue that God is really on the side of those who have been oppressed, that God is not okay with that. And that really makes us think about how we treat people. When you read the scripture and you read about Jesus's encounters with so many different people throughout his life and how he dealt with women, how he dealt with children, how he dealt with those who were oppressed, I think that is so significant to the story of God. And so as God deals with women, as Jesus deals with women, it shows us just how important women are in the life of the church and in the life of the human experience. So I think that there just is not enough time to discuss all of the amazing women in scripture. I mean, I think about the Queen of Sheba, who came from Africa to Israel. You got to look that story up because that's an amazing story of this amazing boss woman who just was the queen. But so I want to challenge all of us to take that extra step as we read scripture, to really try to understand the stories of women, to really highlight those stories, and then to read theologians who are women, particularly Black women, to help us to get a different perspective to scripture. Because I guarantee when you read the whole story that is inclusive of women, it gives a whole new meaning to some of these passages. And so God did not leave out any of this for a reason. It is intended for us to read the whole scripture, to read the stories of the women and the men and the children, and see just how inclusive and redemptive the story of God is.